Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Pei. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadron women of Long Island in honor of the engagement of Clear Blumenreich, grandson of Ricky Zibit. As they build their bayit Ne'eman B'Yisrael, both literally and figuratively, we are certain that they will draw open the strong foundations of Torah and Ahavat Ha'am V'Ha'aretz. May you and the Jewish nation continue to be proud of them. Mazal Tov. Okay, we'll get started today with a quick review of the beginning of the Mishna that we started. We have blood that got mixed up. Blood from blemished animals, blood with regular animals. We had two different situations. One, all the blood is mixed together. In that case, it has to be dumped in the channel. But if it's kos bekosot, we have different cups from different animal, right, from each animal, and we just don't know which are the blemished, which are not. Then we get into this machloket, Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, which is very similar to the same machloket they had about the limbs of the blemished animals and the regular animals. The Gemara is going to ask, what are we learning from? Right? Why do we have to say that they have a machloket in both? Wouldn't it be obvious? Right? These are, again, separate parts like limbs, and we just don't know which are which. Cups of blood. Why would there be any difference? There is no difference, but why did the Mishna need to tell us? We'll get to that in the Gemara. Then, right, so again, Rabbi Eliezer says this whole thing, the first one you do, we can be tolim. And as you're not supposed to do it at all. But if you were to take the blood of one cup and put it on the altar, then we can assume that that was the problematic one and permit all the others. The rabbi said no. Even if you did all of them and there's only one left, you still can't do it. Then we started with, and now we're going to have a whole bunch of good sacrifices that the blood gets mixed up. In the first case we saw yesterday, the blood from the ones that go above got mixed with the blood from the ones below, meaning let's say you have a chatat and an ola. Okay? So if that happens, Rabbi Eliezer says you put them up above, and then you do what we call rowing. We just assume that whatever you put above that's not supposed to be above is as if it's water, and you're fine, because you're not putting something on the altar that shouldn't be there, because you're not actually offering it for the sake of offering it. If it's all good blood, then the blood that's supposed to be there, great. If not, you're saying whatever's not supposed to be here, I view like water. Which you could see why not everyone would agree with that. It's a little, right? In the end, you are putting blood there that maybe doesn't belong there. And that's why the rabbis say, no, you can't do this at all. You have to spill it all out in the Amma. And again, we have this struggle between, right, would we rather waste kachim or would we rather avoid, right, disgracing the altar by putting the wrong thing on the altar, that pull. Okay, but in the end, the rabbis agree that if it was done, it's done and it's fine. They just would prefer you not do that. Now we get to our daf. Now we're going to have other korbanot mixed in, which have either the same rules or different rules. So let's say right now we're all on, either they're all below or they're all above. We're now on below because they're nitanim b'matana achat. So remember, the only ones that go at the top of the altar, if we're talking about animals, not birds, is the sin offering. But now we have sacrifices. This all takes us back to Ezu Mokoman Shel Zevachim, that whole chapter about all the different details. Which korbanot get what? There's some that have only one placement on the altar, and that's the Bechor, Maaser, and Pesach. There's one placing of blood. So, nitanim b'matana achat, shenitaru b'nitanim b'matana achat. You have two different animals, blood that got confused. Some is say a Bechor, one is a Maaser, or two different Bechorim. Okay, but it's from two different animals. So, yinatnu b'matana achat. You basically, okay, it sounds like if it's two different cups and you're just not sure which is which, so that's very easy. There's no suffix. You pour them both on the altar the way you're supposed to. It's pretty clear. But if the blood is mixed together, you actually only need, right now the Gemara thinks that what we're talking about is, okay, we'll see later, maybe, the way to explain the Mishnah right now is, so if you have a cup that has a combination, you just do one placement of blood. Why is that? Rashi tells us, at this point, okay, what do we mean at this point? Well, we mean the way the Gemara is going to initially understand this Mishnah is that hashda amrinan yesh bila. Okay, kasakadatin hashda. They think now, de amrinan yesh bila. This is a concept we're going to talk about a lot today. What does bila mean? Bila means that if I have some blood from one animal and blood from another, and it mixed up together, any spoonful, cupful, whatever, any cupful that I take or any spilling I'm going to do from there, throwing on the altar or placing on the altar, anything I take out of there is going to be a combination of the two. If there was 50% of one and 50% of the other, then everything I take out of there is going to be 50% of this and 50% of that. We're going to assume, basically all this means is, we're going to assume this was mixed completely evenly. So if there was 60-40, then anything I take out of there will be 60-40. So if I then take the blood and put it on the altar, what happens? Well, I've actually put from both sacrifices. Because when I take out, I have, whether it's 60-40, 70-30, it doesn't matter. I still have blood from this animal and blood from that animal. Okay, the opposite way to look at this, if you would say ein bila, then you would say if I took out some, and there was, let's say, 50-50, I might have taken completely all of it from one animal. And maybe what's left, right, has that all the rest of that, the other animal, all of the blood from the other animal is left in what's left, is in the rest of the combination. So the rest of the mixture. Then I wouldn't be able to do matana achat, because then I wouldn't be able to take care of all the blood. So that's the second explanation. Okay, that's if we say ein bila. But this Mishnah obviously says yesh bila, or at least I say obviously right now we think that's what it means. Okay, hold off on this till later today. But right now it sounds like you do matana achat, and with that you cover yourself, because any placing of blood you're going to do, any blood you take out of there, is going to be a percentage of that one, right? Whatever percentage of blood comes from each animal, that's the percentage of blood that's going to be in whatever you take out and put on the altar. Same thing for matan arba, matan arba. You don't do matan arba. If you're supposed to do 4 placings of blood, then you do 4 placings of blood, right? You basically do 4 placings of blood. And again, each placing was taken from a combo of both sacrifices or all sacrifices, right? If you had multiple sacrifices, it would work, because we assume whatever was there, you've covered yourself. What if you have, and here comes the more complicated case, matan arba b'matana achat. You have a bechor mixed up with an ola. Okay, so they're all supposed to go at the bottom of the altar, but the ola needs 4 placings of blood, and again, 4 corners. Remember, it's 2 placings that are 4, but the point is you need more placings of blood than the other. Remember, 1 is really 2 because you do it on the corner and you get on 2 sides, and 2 is 4 because you get on all 4 sides by doing 2 placings. So what do we do now? Do we do 1 placing that's 2, or do we do 2 that are 4, right? So the Mishnah is going to just call it 1 and 4. So we'll go with 1 and 4. Rabbi Eliezer omer, yinatznu b'matan arba. So Rabbi Eliezer says we do 4. Now this matches perfectly with Rabbi Eliezer's approach, because Rabbi Eliezer says we can just do rowing, right? Just like above and below. We didn't worry that maybe some of the blood of the ola ended up on top, because here we do 4, and in 4 you're going to cover, right, 1 and 4. So you're always going to go with the higher, because you could just say, if I ended up with blood that's not supposed to be put, which I definitely did, because if we say yesh bila and it's all combined, and then I go around, so I'm obviously putting some blood from the one that will only need 1 placement. I'm doing it on 4. But it doesn't bother us, because what did we say before? Ro'in, right? Ro'ani etatachtonim, kilu, right? That went lamala, kilu hem mayim. I just look at that blood that went from the wrong korban as if it's water. Rabbi Yehoshua omer, yinatznu b'matana achat. He says, no, you do 1 placing of blood, that's it. You can't do extra. If you remember also, the ones that are 4, you can be yotze actually with 1 placement, right? So it also makes kind of sense. And the real issue is that he's concerned, in a second we're going to see with Bal Tosif, you're adding to a mitzvah, okay? And Rabbi Eliezer is concerned with Bal Tigara, you're reducing a mitzvah. So we're going to have a big argument between the two of them. We've seen a bunch of these Mishnayot with these talking arguments, discussion arguments between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. Here's another one. So Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Harei Wovera Bal Tigra. You're not allowed to deduct from mitzvot. Okay, the classic is, let's say, instead of bringing 4 minim on 4 species on Sukkot, you bring 3. Okay, you're not allowed to do that. So here, instead of doing 4 placements, you're doing 1. That's a problem. Trying to think why he doesn't have this problem that if you did 1, you'll be yotze. I feel like I'm missing something here about that. I'll try to look for a minute. But anyway, he says this is Bal Tigra, and this is, I just want to check one and see if I can figure out, because I didn't think about that till right now. Right, that's the issue. Yeah, I remember. Because the issue of doing that you can, if you only did one, it's fine, that's b'di'evet, that's post facto. Here we're standing, and this is what we call lichatchila. Now, you could say it's a b'di'evet situation. It's a post facto situation because the blood got mixed. But the issue is that you can't, in other words, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you can't, well, not according to anyone, you can't say, I'm going to go ahead and only do one placing of the blood when you know you're obligated in 4. It's only if for whatever reason only one was done, you can fulfill your obligation that way. But that's what we call b'di'evet post facto. So now Rabbi Eliezer says, Harei wover bal tikara, and you haven't fulfilled your mitzvah because you did only one when you really have to do 4. Amar le Rabbi Yehoshua, Harei wover bal tosif, right? It says you're not allowed to add to the mitzvah, you're not allowed to detract, just like you can't have 3 of the minim in the lulav, lulav etrog hadasa rava, you need all 4. You also can't do 5. Okay? Same, right. The classic example is also tefillin. Those are things that have a certain number associated with them, and you can't do more or less. Here also, there's a number associated with it. You can't do more or less. So Rabbi Yehoshua says you're over on Bal Tosif. So, right, each one has a good claim. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, lo ne'amar Bal Tosif, ela kashu ba'atzmo. Bal Tosif is only an issue, like we said, you have tefillin, and it's 1 tefillin, and you're adding to it. Instead of 4, you're doing 5. Okay? But in this case, Rabbi Eliezer says that's when you have 1 mitzvah and you're doing too much of it. In this case, we have not the mitzvah standing by itself, but we have a combination. In other words, this is a totally different situation. This is a situation where we have a tarov and a mixture. That's different. When it's by itself and you want to say you can't add, you can't detract, here there's a reason to do it. Here there's a reason, right? In other words, he says, Rabbi Eliezer says, Bal Tosif is only when it's by itself. I'm not worried about Bal Tosif because this is a mixture, and we understand we're doing it just to be Yotze, right? Especially if he says Rowan, right? It's not really something that concerns him. And even if you won't say Rowan, this is just not relevant for Bal Tosif because Bal Tosif is, I know the mitzvah of sukkah is 7 days. I'm going to sit in the sukkah for 8 days. That's a problem. But if you're not sure, okay, here's a good example. Sukkah, right? We have Sveika, right? We have second day yantif, right? How do you sit in the sukkah 8 days? It's actually a big question about Tosif. And some of them say it's Bal Tosif if you sit in the sukkah, and that's why people have all different kind of minagim. There's ways to round it, but theoretically you could look at it a little bit like this. It's a suffix, right? It's not a regular situation of Bal Tosif. It's because maybe today's the day, maybe the next day is the day. Okay, without getting too much off. Amar lo Rabbi Yehoshua, lo ne'emar Bal Tigra, ela kashu ba'atzmo. So Rabbi Yehoshua says the same thing. You say the issue is Bal Tigra. Bal Tigra is also only when it's by itself. So how can you say that's the issue that I can't detract? Okay, I want to make sure I said that right because I see from someone's chat maybe I said this wrong. But right, the whole issue is you're only supposed to sit in the sukkah 7 days. You're not allowed to sit in the sukkah 8 days, and that's why there's a whole question in Chutz La'aretz. I kind of said very quickly, maybe I wasn't clear. Chutz La'aretz is a question: are you supposed to sit in the sukkah or not? So in the end, the real psak is right. You're supposed to sit in the sukkah and not make a bracha, but there's all sorts of other things that people do, all different kinds of minagim that developed over time about this issue. But part of the issue is this whole issue of Bal Tosif that comes up there. Okay, so now, but that's a whole other topic, so not for today. V'od amar Rabbi Yehoshua, kishenatata. Okay, so now Rabbi Yehoshua is going to have the last word. He says, listen, kishenatata avaltar Bal Tosif v'asita ma'aseh biyadecha. Kishelo natata avarta Bal Tigra v'lo asita ma'aseh biyadecha. So now we say, in the end, right, it seems they're both equal. Either you're going to have Bal Tosif or Bal Tigra in a case of a tarovet, or you're not going to have it. And they can each argue whatever they want to argue, but in the end, it's really equal. It's either yes or it's either no to both. But comes Rabbi Yehoshua and he says, I have a big advantage over you. Because you said it's Bal, right, that basically, in other words, if you did Bal Tigra, which you think is the issue, so you just didn't do anything. But avarta Bal Tosif, if you, right, my concern of Bal Tosif is you actually did something intentionally. You did an action, okay? There's a difference between an action and a sheva al taseh, we call it. Sheva al taseh means sit and do nothing. So my attitude is sit and do nothing because you're not sure if it's Bal Tigra, Bal Tosif, so just don't do anything. So do your one matana, and that's it, and then sit and don't do anything. You want to do 3 extra matanot that might be adding, and you're doing an action in doing it. It's much worse to do an action that's wrong than to just sit and do nothing. That's a principle that comes up a lot. The difference between kumase, get up and do something, which is what Rabbi Eliezer wants to do, and sheval taseh, which is what Rabbi Yehoshua wants to do. Kind of like leaving status quo, like just not doing anything. So it's true, you might be doing something wrong, but it's if all things are equal, better to do it that way. So that's the big discussion between them, and now we're going to get to the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. So now we're back to a sugya we already saw, which is, in the first case, really the second case, the kos b'kosot, Rabbi Eliezer said, if you did one, then you can do all the rest. Remember, we said that's only if you bring them in pairs. So again, they're going to quote that. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, the Amora, comes and says, Lo chshir Rabbi Eliezer ela shnayim shnayim. Rabbi Eliezer only permitted if you do it in pairs after. So you have to bring the kosot to the altar in pairs together, because we want to make sure you have at least one that's definitely permitted, because you know that one is forbidden. So if you bring 2 together, at least you have one that's permitted. Which again, not so clear how that resolves anything, but he seems to think that that would work. But you can't do them one at a time. Mativ Rav Dimi. Last time it was Rabbi Yirmiyah. This time it's Rav Dimi says, Chachamim omrim afilu kervu kulan chutz me'echad mehem yishafech lama. But the rabbi said, and it doesn't make sense if that's his position, because the rabbi said even if you only leave one, right? If you did them all and leave just one, you have to spill it. Which seems that Rabbi Eliezer would disagree in that case and say, no, if you leave just one, of course you can bring that one, and that's not in a pair. So how would you be able to say that? And this seems to disagree with what he said. So Amalei Rabbi Yaakov, the Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, interesting, he doesn't answer Rav Dimi, he answers Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa. He says to him, here's an answer to what Rav Dimi brought. Ez baralach ma echad zug echad. What is echad here? One pair. It doesn't mean one, it means one pair of cups of blood. Okay, so with that we resolved that, which we already knew because we've seen this sugya before. Now we're going to do why we need to see that Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis disagreed, both in the case of the limbs and in the case of the blood getting mixed up. So, tzricha. Okay, they don't even tell you what they're talking about, the tzricha, but that's obviously what they're talking about. We need them both. Why do we need them both? Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen because the study guide starts here. Okay, so now we have it tzricha. Why do we need both of these cases? The ivareh, the ivarim, the limbs, and the blood. Itmar baha, if you had it there with the limbs, what would you say? Baha ka'amar Rabbi Eliezer. In that case, Rabbi Eliezer allows you to bring them and burn them on the altar. Why? Because when are we dealing with the limbs? After the blood was already done. The blood was already done completely properly. And therefore, we're going to allow you to just finish up. But baha emamodi rabbanan. But when this is the blood, that's the main part, and the blood has blemished animals mixed in, maybe they would agree with the rabbis that you can't do this. V'id marbaha, now from that same logic, if we just had the case of our Mishna, where they have a machloket in the blood, you would say baha kamri rabbanan. That's why the rabbis forbade it, because you haven't yet done the atonement. And maybe now you have a problem, we're not going to allow you to bring this. Aval beha, but in the case of the limbs, Rabbi Eliezer, you might think they would agree with Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore it's tzricha. You need them both. Okay, Tznan hatam. Now we start with a Mishnah. We're going to bring a Mishnah from Parah, which actually we saw part of this before, but we saw something of this later. We'll quote something where we made this comparison. We tried to learn the blood from the sprinkling about whether you need a requisite amount for the blood. This was on Daf Ayin Hey, and they brought this topic of whether dam chatat needs, and they tried to say, just like blood, just like the sprinkling has a shear or doesn't have a shear, also the blood won't have a shear, and then they rejected that. But now they're going to bring in this topic, and then later we're going to bring it back to our Mishnah and compare it to the blood and assume that the same is true for both, about the bila issue. This is really where we're going to get into what we talked about in the Mishnah, about things being combined. So what we're going to do in this section is we're going to bring a machloket Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis about a mixture of the Parah Aduma, the red heifer waters. We're going to talk about whether they hold there is bila, there isn't bila, and a bunch of other things. They're going to have a little bit, they're going to kind of explain the rabbi's opinion pretty easily. Then they're going to have 3 different opinions, Reish Lakish, Rav, and Rav Ashi, about how to understand Rabbi Eliezer's position, because Rabbi Eliezer's position really is a little bit complicated to understand. Then we're going to ask a difficulty one difficulty on Reish Lakish, and then 6 difficulties on Rav Ashi. The last one is really in tomorrow's daf, so we won't do that one today. But that's the structure of what we're going to do. So we start with this case in Parah. Okay, it's a Mishna in Parah, chapter 9, verse Mishna Aleph. So we have a bowl with Parah Aduma waters in it, the red heifer waters that we use to sprinkle people who become impure to the dead. And a little bit of water fell into there. Okay, now in the beginning, we're going to say that the little bit is not exactly a drop. It's more than a drop. Later, we're going to go back to saying, what do you mean? It says kolshu. Okay, but you have to, it's a little tricky. So assume right now, kolshu means some water. We don't know how much. Some water fell into this water. So you're going to see why this is similar to our blood and our blood. And Rabbi Eliezer is going to disagree with the rabbis, just like in our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, yazeh shtei hazaot. In order to resolve this problem, what's the problem? The problem is that when we sprinkle on you, maybe we're sprinkling the water that was not Parah Aduma water. And as it doesn't disqualify the mixture, the problem is that when we're sprinkling, maybe we're only sprinkling or maybe, we don't know, okay? But let's just say, in this sprinkle, there might be some of the other water mixed in, and then we're going to have to figure out, okay, so what and how and whatever. It's all going to depend on bila, not bila, which we'll talk about. So right now, you're not supposed to understand anything, so don't worry. Yazeh shtei hazaot. You sprinkle 2 sprinklings on the person. Normally, you sprinkle 1. This time, you sprinkle 2. Chachamim posli. They say you can't use this at all for sprinkling. So bishlama rabbanan. So we get the rabbis, because we're going to have 3 issues that are going to come up here, and that's why we're going to have 3 different opinions in where they each think that Rabbi Eliezer holds on each of those 3 issues. But bishlama rabbanan, savre yesh bila. So the first thing the rabbis hold is there's bila. What does bila mean? It means that if there's, right, whatever percentage of water got into, let's say it's 99% of it is red heifer waters and 1% is regular water. So when I do a sprinkling, it's going to be 99% red heifer water and 1% regular water. Okay? No matter how much I use, whatever it's going to be, that's going to be the percentage of every drop I throw. In which case, okay, so it should be good then because you're getting red heifer waters on you. But But he also holds, in a different issue that's up for debate, is there a minimum requirement? That's what we saw this sugya before. Is there a minimum requirement for sprinkling? Now, that means that you have to do a sprinkle's worth, which means that if I sprinkle and it's 99% water, 99% red heifer water, and 1% regular water, obviously I don't have a complete shiur because 1% is not red heifer waters. And you'd have to say one last thing, which is ein mitztarfin lahazaot. If I do 2 in a row, they don't combine. So that's why the rabbis say this is completely disqualified, this red heifer waters, because there's never a way I could sprinkle someone. Because the only way to sprinkle someone is to have enough of a shiur of proper mechatat. I have to sprinkle it in one sprinkle, and in one sprinkle I only get, I get the exact amount I need in a sprinkle. And that's always going to have some other water mixed in, and it's never going to have enough of what I need, which is I need 100% mechatat. So that's the rabbi's position. That explains pretty well. Ela Rabbi Eliezer my kasavar. So now we're going to have a problem. And we're going to go through 4 stages. You're going to see it's like 3 that kind of break into 4. Because we're going to have to see what does he hold on each of these issues. I kasavar ein bila. If he holds, there's no bila. Now again, you have to remember that right now we're understanding kolshu doesn't mean a drop. Kolshu means a certain amount. So let's go with 10%, 90%. Okay? So we have 10% water in here, 90% red heifer waters. If you say ein bila, what does that mean? It means that when I go to sprinkle water from this mixture, it could be from the 10% of the red heifer, of the problematic, just regular water. It could be from the red heifer waters. We don't know. So, according to Rabbi Eliezer, what do we do to resolve the problem? We do 2 sprinkles. But if 10% of this mixture is regular water, and we hold ein bila, every drop I take could be from the 10%, could be from the 90%, could be a combination, but we have no idea. How do the 2 sprinklings help us? Maybe both of them are actually just regular water. So it can't be he holds that. It must be ela kasavar yesh bila. So far he's in agreement with the rabbis about that. Now let's go to the next issue. Maybe he thinks it doesn't need a shear. Well then, let's think about it. If you don't need a shear, and 90% of your sprinkling was red heifer waters, 10%, right? If you hold bila, then it's the exact same combination. 10% is the regular water. Well, if you don't have a requisite amount that's needed, as long as you get any kind of sprinkle, you're fine, then lama lishtei haza'ot. You could do it all in the first sprinkling. You have 90% good waters, or any percentage of good waters would work. So you don't need two. Ela kasavar haza'at tzricha shiur. So he must hold it needs a requisite amount, and that's what the second one is doing. Well, then we still have an issue, because ikasavar ein mitzdarfin lahaza'ot ki mazeh shtei haza'ot mehave. Now, if you hold ein mitzdarfin lahaza'ot, you can't combine sprinklings. Well, then for sure, two sprinklings aren't going to help you, because if you can't combine sprinkling 1 and sprinkling 2, you need a whole shiur in each. Well, then you're stuck, right? There's no way to do it. So obviously he doesn't hold that, then he'd be like the rabbis, because then he would hold yesh bila haza'at tzricha shiur, and they're not mitzdarif. That's exactly what the rabbis hold. Inami mitzdarfin lahaza'ot. Now, if you say they do hold that you can combine them together, mi yemer demale le shiura. Now, in this case, we have no idea how much water fell in. Now, it did say kol shehu, so it's a little strange they're asking this. But what they're saying is, let's say there was more water than red heifer waters. So how do you know that you're getting a complete shiur? Okay, you don't have any way to know, right? Assuming that the ratio is more water, and it doesn't say, as long as it's more. So that wouldn't help you. In 2 haza'ot, you still might not get enough of a shiur. So we're stuck. Now we're going to start with our answers. Amar Reish Lakish. Lo'olam yesh bila. We assume there is bila. Okay, that for sure, Reish Lakish thinks he says. And haza'at tzricha shiur. So the first two are fine. Just like we said, there's bila, you need a certain amount, and then we're going to figure out, right, what about the mitzdaref issue? Because we said, if they can be mitzdaref, we still have a problem because we don't know how much is there. Well, he's going to resolve that, because he's going to say, hacha b'mayaskinan, what's the case? Kigon shenitarvu achat be'echat. Okay, we're going to say that they were 1-to-1 ratio. So, okay, now, it could be 1-to-1. You could understand this as long as there's, okay, you need a certain shear of a sprinkling. So what we have with the amount of water that fell in, we're now going to say, when it says kolshu, what it means is one amount of a sprinkle. So now if you have exactly one amount of a sprinkle of problematic water, then it doesn't matter really how much of red heifer waters, but let's play it out. Half of it will be in the first sprinkle, half of it will be in the second sprinkle, right? And altogether you only have a sprinkle's worth. So at that, or let's say, right, there's way more of the other, you're going to have even less. Either which way, it's going to be at least it's at maximum is going to take up half a sprinkle of the first and half a sprinkle of the second. So what's left? A good, right? Then you're left with at least 50% in the first and 50% in the second of a good sprinkle of the red heifer waters. So if you have, you have to say the amount, and it all depends on how much water, according to him. If the amount of problematic water is exactly one sprinkle's worth, then in 2 sprinkles you'll definitely get a complete sprinkle. Okay, that's the first answer. Rava Amal, Le'olam yesh bila, v'haza'ah ein tzricha shiur. So now he changes the second machloket. He says, yes, there's bila. It's, again, percentage-wise, whatever fell in, that's what's going to come on every single sprinkle that you're doing. And the haza'ah doesn't need a shear at all. Okay? Now, so that means, theoretically, let's just talk about this. According to Rava right now, what's the problem with this? Well, if there's bila and every sprinkle has part and part, and you don't need a minimum amount for sprinkling, well then as soon as you sprinkle 1, you should be fine. Why does Rabbi Eliezer need 2? And by the way, I wrote here that whether the haza'ot combine, 2 can combine is an irrelevant issue, because you don't need them to combine. Combining is only to get to a requisite amount. There is no requisite amount. So then really, why do you need 2? What are the rabbis worried about? Like people want to make things go farther, so they dilute it with more water or something cheaper, right? It's a good way to make something go farther. So we're worried. Paraduma waters are very expensive. We're worried that if you see that since there's bila, and since haza'ah doesn't need a shear, you can basically mix in regular water with your mechatat and make it go much farther. So maybe you'll do that if you see this works. So what do they say? No, you have to do 2 hazaot as a punishment, as a penalty, I should say. As a penalty so that you don't say, so basically whatever you gain, you're now losing because you're sprinkling it another sprinkle. Okay? So that's why you have to do 2. So the 2 is totally not relevant to our issue. It's just we don't want people to take advantage and start mixing water with paraduma waters. But Rav Ashi Amal, and here if you look in the side note, it adds some words from a different girsa, which I want to read because I think they're interesting. The Rav Ashi starts off according to this other version, not the one said in our Gemara, but Mayim Kol Shutna. First he disagrees with the other 2, and he says, neither of you are fitting with the words of this Mishnah, because the Mishnah. The Mishnah says kolshu. Kolshu is a teeny bit. So first of all, Rava, it's totally irrelevant. We're not worried about penalizing someone or putting this penalty in to prevent someone from adding more water when we're talking about a drop, right? That's not a big savings of any kind of money or anything. So that's an irrelevant issue. And according to Reish Lakish, remember he said where it was a complete drop and the whole problem, he says there's a drop, a teeny drop. It's certainly not going to be, you don't need to say it's a whole shear of haza'ah here. It's just one drop. So your explanation is completely wrong. So now we have to explain what's Rav Ashi's position. So he has a big change from all the others because he says, Ein bila. Okay? That's his first thing he says. And yazeh shtei hazaot. So his whole thing is Ein bila. Because now, let's play it all out. He points out that there's just a kolshu, a teeny drop. So now, if you say, right, if you start sprinkling, then what's the problem? Well, maybe you have a kolshu. Maybe your drop, okay, if there's no bila, it could be that the kolshu, what are you sprinkling? Maybe you're sprinkling the one that's water. Because if there's no bila, then we don't look at everything as a combo of both. Maybe the one you're sprinkling is the one that's specifically just plain water. So because of that, you need to sprinkle a second time. Okay, so he doesn't think you need a minimum requisite amount. He doesn't think, obviously, then you don't need them to combine because that's irrelevant. So the only thing he basically says that is the most important thing here is there's no bila. Because there's no bila, you need 2. Because the first one might be just plain water. The second one, you'll be yotzei your chiyuv for sure because there's only a kol shehu. Okay, and therefore there's not enough for 2 sprinkles of the water. So 2 sprinkles covers you. It's actually the simplest answer, but it's going to be the one that's going to cause the most problems, and you'll see in a minute. So now we're going to start our series of questions. The first is on Reish Lakish. Now, you have to see, this is why I like to chart out, because you see Reish Lakish answers yes to all 3 questions. Rava answers yes to Bila, no to the rest. Rav Ashi answers no to everything. So where does Reish Lakish differ from everyone? On Haza'at Tzricha Shiur. He thinks that according to Rabbi Eliezer, Haza'ah needs a requisite amount. And here we go to the sugya we already learned, which is Meitivei, Rebbe Omer, we saw this on Ayin Hey, L'divrei Rabbi Eliezer, Haza'ah koshu matayeret. According to Rabbi Eliezer, there is no shear. If you sprinkle a teeny drop, it works. Why? Because Haza'ah ain't Tzricha Shiur, because Haza'ah doesn't have any requisite amount. There it's clear, black and white, at least according to Rebbe, that Rabbi Eliezer does not hold the Haza'ah needs a shear. That completely goes against Reish Lakish, and therefore Haza'ah mechza kasher, mechza pasul. That you could have a partial one, partially kasher, partially pasul, and it actually works. Okay, so that's really a big question to Reish Lakish, to which the Gemara doesn't even have any answer. Now we're going to go to the 6 questions on Rav Ashi, which I told you today we'll get to 5. Tomorrow we'll get to the 6, which is at the very bottom of this stuff, really more into tomorrow's stuff. And now we're going to go into really, this is why this is here, because this relates to our Mishnah. Because now we're going to talk about Rabbi Eliezer's position in our Mishnah and how that relates here. But first we're going to quote Rabbi Eliezer from a braitot, okay, which is very similar in our Mishnah, but it happens to be in a braitot. Ve'od Tanya behedya. And also it's a little weird because the first question was on Reish Lakish, and now they say, and also we have a problem on Rav Ashi. Okay, you have to know that because it doesn't say that explicitly. Now the problem here is where does Rav Ashi differ from everyone? Right, where he has no overlap with anyone is the issue of Ein Bila. He holds that according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's no such thing as Bila, which means if you have a combination, like we're going to see in our Mishnah and in this Braita, of korbanot, that the blood got mixed, of ones that go above and ones that go below, we're going to see Rabbi Eliezer's position and see it doesn't seem to match. Hanitanim lemala, shenitarvu b'nitanim lemata, okay, we're at the top of Amud Bet here. if the ones that are brought at the top are mixed with the ones that are brought at the bottom of the altar, we're talking about blood again. We're comparing blood and sprinkling it here. It's obvious to compare them because it's the same idea of mixtures, combination of good and bad, or right and wrong. There's no good and bad here. It's just the right ones for here, the wrong ones for there. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yitem lamala, v'atachtonim alulo. So what does he say? Put the blood on top first, then go to the bottom, and it'll work to cover you for the top ones and work to cover you for the bottom ones. Now, why would this work? You can, without reading it inside, it's obvious. Because of Bila, we assume that in every placing of blood you're doing, you have part of the ones that are supposed to go above and part of the ones that are supposed to go below. And remember, he said the part that you're not doing is, right, you say, oh, we just assume I'm doing part of right, and the other part is just water. Okay, like putting water on the altar. So, now the problem is, you can't really say Ein Bila. Why? This sounds very much like the whole sugya we saw in Kinim, right? It could be you completely brought, let's say you have 50-50, okay? And you did half above and half below. Maybe the half above you did was all the ones that are supposed to go below, and the half below you did were all the ones that are supposed to go above. So you can't possibly say that he holds Ein Bila, because otherwise this wouldn't work. To which they answer, and this is going to be the answer that's going to be mostly the answer for all of these. Okay, I gave numbers here. It doesn't have to be these numbers, but the main point is that the ones that have to go above the sin offerings are 60% of the blood you have. And the ones that have to go below are only 40%. And then you go above, and you do more than the amount of the tachtonim. So, okay, let's just spell it out. If the tachtonim are 40%, what's supposed to go at the bottom is 40%. And at the above, you put 50%. Okay, let's say you did 50-50. Okay, 50 above, 50 below. Again, you can pick many different examples here. But the main point is that above, okay, you have two main points here, that whatever numbers you choose, it has to be. That above, there's a higher percentage than below. And what you put at the top was more than the amount of blood you have for the bottom of the altar. So what's the worst case scenario if there's no bila? If you put 50% of the bloods above, what do you have in the worst case scenario? All the blood of the bottom went at the top. So 40% of what you put at the top is bottom blood. But you still have 10% is top blood. So you basically covered your sacrifice at the top because you at least have some of the blood from there went on the altar. Remember, all the blood doesn't need to go. There's always the remainder. So you at least covered the top with the top, okay? Which sounds good. What's the problem? Well, that doesn't work perfectly because that might have covered your top, but what about the bottom? At the bottom, what are you left with in the worst case scenario? Only blood from the sin offerings, and now you want to do them at the bottom, which is wrong. And what did the braitot say? Rabbi Eliezer says, put them above, and that works, and put them below, and atachtonim alulo, and the bottom ones will also count for you. So, hatachtonim alulo katani. You can't say that in this situation. If the majority were the top and the majority were the bottom, you could have put all the bottom ones on top. At least you covered the top because you filled it in, right? To get to the amount you put, there were more in the, right? You put more, which means you definitely included from the top. But now you're left with nothing at the bottom that really belongs to the bottom. Again, this is the worst case scenario. So they say, oh, when he said the tachtonim worked for you, what he meant is l'shem shirayim. In other words, the bottom ones work no matter what. Now, they don't necessarily work to cover your obligation of the ola, but they could either work as ola, if you happen to have the bottom ones mixed in there, or if it was all top ones, well, the top ones anyway have to go at the bottom because they're the remainder, what's left from what you did above. You put some of them above, and now the rest of it goes on the bottom of the altar. So either which way, you're covered with the bottom ones. Okay, that was the first difficulty. Second one, tashma. The braitot continues. Natan lamata v'lo nimlach. What if the kohen didn't ask? Okay, he's supposed to put them above first, then below. Okay, but what if he didn't do that? Natan lamata v'lo nimlach. So he just puts them below. Rabbi Eliezer homeo yachzor v'yiten lamala v'atachtonim alulo. Okay, you go and put above after that, and the bottom ones also. In other words, and again, this worked and that worked. So what do they say? And then it seems to be problematic. If there's no bila, then how do we know that they all worked? It could be you put them in the wrong place. So they're going to answer this in the exact same way. Hachinami beruba elyonim, v'kayav shiur lamala v'tachtonim lamala shiur tachtonim va'od. Again, the majority was above, and what you ended up doing above was more than the percentage of how much you had of below, and therefore you definitely have ones above. But again, the same problem. Katani. Here it's difficult to say the shirayim. Why? Because you did the tachtonim first. That can't be remainder. But the Gemara says l'shem shirayim. They say no, the bottom ones counted for remainder. Okay, this is a bit of a strange answer. There's two ways to resolve it. One is to claim, which is a weird claim, that you could deal with the remainder before you do the first ones, before you actually do the placings of the blood, which would be strange. Some people say, which also doesn't really work with the words, that when Rabbi Eliezer says you have to, if you put them below first, you have to put them above, what he really means to say is you have to put them above, and then you have to go back and do some at the bottom. And those are the ones that worked for him. Again, either which way, it's a little bit of a stretch, but we're going to leave it. Third difficulty, tashma. Nitanan lamala v'lo nimlach. Now, what if you put it above and you didn't ask? Now, here we're going to really go back to the rabbis. The rabbis say you're not allowed to do this. But if you already did it, elu ve'elu modim she'achzor v'yitein lamata. Okay, this is the same for Rabbi Eliezer, because he said anyway that's what you're supposed to do. But according to the rabbis who didn't allow this at all, they say, well, if you already put lamala, then we allow you to continue and put lamata, and elu ve'elu alulo. Now, so now, how does this work? Because again, now, we're back to just the same problem that we already answered. And that's what they're going to say. Like, how does this work according to Rabbi Eliezer if he holds ein bila? To which they answer, again, the same answer. And as they go back to as if you forgot the previous answers, you didn't know that. And we're reading this with new eyes, as if you didn't know that answer. So again, hachinami beruba elyonim v'kayav lamala shiur tachtonim va'od. Okay, same answer. The reason why it works above and below is because there's more above. And you gave a higher, right? You gave enough above that it included, at worst case, all was below. In addition, there was some above. And therefore you were covered. And what about the bottom? Right now, elu ve'elu alulo. Now here, they don't answer the shirayim answer. Maybe because they have a different answer. There's some other people that explain a different reason why they don't, but I'll show you here what the problem is. Ha'elu ve'elu alulo katane. Now, elu ve'elu alulo sounds like the upper ones and the bottom ones count for him both according to Rabbi Eliezer and according to the rabbis, because this one relates to both of them. And then we're going to have a problem because how could the bottom ones? Maybe there's only top ones there. And again, we answered earlier Shirayim. Some people explain why we couldn't have answered Shirayim here, but here they give a different answer. Mikatani, now there's two Elu ve'elus here. If you did it above and you didn't ask, Elu ve'elu means Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis both agree, and the big chiddush is the rabbis even agree that you could continue and do it lamata once you already started. But elu ve'elu alulo, we also assumed was according to both opinions. Well, now to resolve the difficulty with Rabbi Eliezer, according to the way Rav Ashi explained it, we just say, mikatani elu ve'elu modim. The second elu ve'elu doesn't say both the rabbis and Rabbi Eliezer agree. The elu ve'elu here is referring to the upper blood and the lower bloods. And, right, elu ve'elu alulo katane, seif atan l'rabanan da'amar yesh bila. Maybe you could just say that this last line isn't according to Rabbi Eliezer at all. It's according to the rabbis, who hold that there is bila, because remember, that's what the rabbis hold. They think it is viewed as a complete combination, and that's why they have no problem. But maybe that elu ve'elu isn't Rabbi Eliezer. Again, it's not the strongest answer, because it doesn't say anywhere this is only according to the rabbis. Okay. Tashma. Now we get to our Mishna. And now we're going to quote. The next three issues are going to come from our Mishna. Like I said, we're only going to do two today, and then we'll stop. Tashma. Hanitanim b'matana achat, shenit arva b'nitanim b'matana achat. If you have bloods that were mixed up, right, one bechor and a bechor, what do? Yinatnu b'matana achat. V'i amart ein bila, amay yinatnu b'matana achat. If you say there's no bila, then what's the problem? How can you give one gift? Because if you give one gift, what's the problem? You're going to end up with a combination. Okay, so now we're going to learn that what they mean by matana achat really means that you have to give one for each. So you do one, and then you do another one, which wasn't so clear before, but now it's going to be clear. So they say, Dilma mehai kayav umehai lo kayav, right? There's a mixture here. Maybe all the blood you're taking is from the one korban and not from the other, because if we don't view each one as a complete combo. So they say, Kigon shenitarvu achat be'achat. You'd have to say that the combo is Or the truth is, you could still say, actually, if we view this, maybe you could say that you only give one matana. Okay, I should correct myself. Matana achat. I assume we mean just one. But now, right, one second. Right, that's what they're going to say, that you actually have to bring two. And, sorry, I am right, that they do think you have to bring two matanot here. And nitravu achat ve'echat. Okay, again, achat ve'echat means like what it meant before. Let's say, it could even be, it doesn't have to be 1-to-1. It could, right, and what they're saying here is there was only one placement's worth of one that got mixed into the other. Could be 1-to-1 ratio, it could be 1-to-5 ratio, it doesn't matter. Because if you have a shear of how much you're supposed to put of blood on the altar, and you do two placings, right? You do one for one and one for the other. And since there was only a measure of one placement of the, let's say, Bechor number one, then in two placings, you're definitely going to cover both animals. So that's what you'd have to say the case is, and that would work with Rav Ashi. And we're going to do the exact same thing in the next one, Matan Arba, Matan Arba, and they're going to say the same thing, Hachinami shenitavu arba ba'arba. Okay, same thing with the 4 and 4. If you have 4 placings that got mixed with 4 placings, then how are you going to do that if ein bila, right? Because maybe you're only doing one korban. And again, the answer is going to be where it's exactly, one of them at least has exactly 4 placings. And therefore, if you do 4 placings and then you do another 4 placings, you're for sure covering both animals in some way. Okay, so that was all our difficulties on Rav Ashi. So what we did in today's daf, we started with the Mishna about how we deal with combinations of bloods that get mixed up with different amounts, cases of where there's different amounts of bloods mixed in. Then we had this machlok at Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua about Bal Tikra or Bal Tosif, which one are we better off doing, more or less? And really it's whether you hold by Rowan or not. Can we view this as if it's just water, which Rabbi Eliezer has no problem with? Rabbi Yehoshua doesn't agree with that. And then we had, so we limited the shnaims in that first case of this, and we talked about the limbs, comparing the blood to the limbs, the combine, and why you needed both to say that there's machlok Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. And then the whole second part, we just dealt with this Mishna in Parah, how to explain Rabbi Eliezer's position in the Mishnah, the 3 different approaches. 1 difficulty was raised on Reish Lakish, and then 6 difficulties, which we haven't seen the 6 yet, were raised on Rav Ashi. If you really hold it, Rabbi Eliezer holds ein bila. How does this all work out with these bloods cases? And where bila clearly is a factor there, to which we came up with ways based on the percentages and based on what we call ukimtas. The cases would only work in particular unique circumstances where there was a higher percentage of the upper blood than the bottom blood. And that would be the only way it would work. And by viewing when it says you fulfilled the bottom, most of the time we had to say that's really the shirayim or something else, not necessarily your sacrifice. And with that, we finish for today.
Recording stopped.
Whoops, I ended early. Wishing everyone a good day.